from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
This week we are very pleased to continue our journey through America's 20th century, and we're going to continue that for several more weeks. Unlike the other programs that we've been doing, we're not today having someone in character, but really the person representing a wonderful subject within our lifetime and in all previous generations, and that is the field of music. We welcome to the program Tim Riley. Our guest is from Boston, Massachusetts, and he was named the web producer and classical editor of the Soundstone Entertainment in March of 1998. Previously, he had worked as a senior editor and producer at Lacoste, where he managed the search engine's popular top 5% database of 10,000 website reviews. Our guest is an author, he is a composer, he's a pianist. He has written 3 books in particular that I would like to bring to your attention. The first one is called Tell Me Why, a Beatles Commentary. The New York Times has hailed this work as a great insight to that outstanding music and its domination for such a period in our history. And the reason we have chosen Beatles, even though we're looking at the America's 20th century, certainly you all know how much influence it's had, and particularly in the 1960s on the youth in our country. He's also the author of Hard Rain, a Dylan commentary, and he wrote Madonna Illustrated. Mr. Riley, it's been a pleasure having you on campus today, and thank you for being on our program. We look forward to our interview.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our 2 regular panelists, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President for College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
The Beatles, of course, originated in England, and then they came to this country, and it was almost a near riot. Their music was very popular and very enjoyable. Rock and roll was here before the Beatles came, though. So how did they change that whole scene? They're a much more complex organization or complex music than the former rock and roll. How did they change it?
Yeah, they brought a lot of interesting new ideas to rock and roll, and they appeared in America in January of 1964 during a time that was considered historically to be sort of a downtime in the history of rock and roll. There were people who were saying that rock and roll had already run out of gas and was dying, and it was not going to be a very popular form for much longer, when all of a sudden the Beatles appeared from England. And the Beatles' approach was so fresh and new and had so many great ideas to it, and they played some of the classic rock and roll standards of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Buddy Holly with such verve and such commitment that it gave rock and roll a whole new life, and it actually did. The British invasion that we refer to, that was led by the Beatles, actually gave rock and roll a whole new lease on life and led to many successive generations of rock and roll.
But their music itself, the music that they created then, became much more complex.
Became much more complex and became that much more complex very quickly. 1964, of course, the year was spent making appearances on Ed Sullivan and making the movie A Hard Day's Night, but by 1965 and 1966 they were already making records that are held as masterpieces now, Rubber Soul and Revolver. If you had to choose 2 that would be, you could say, were the greatest things they ever accomplished, those would be the 2 that I would choose. And those records are busy expanding all different corners of rock and roll, from the many different styles that it can embrace to the many different chords that a rock and roll song can include, and the many different subtle aspects of expression that a rock and roll song can include. So it's rock and roll song becomes something much more than a teenager coming of age and dealing with romantic issues. It really becomes sort of an adult music form at that point.
Steve Schenck.
Tim, maybe we can take just a few minutes and put that musical genre into a little bit better perspective. It's been a long time since '64. Rock and roll certainly has endured. How's the legacy of the Beatles endured? Where do they stand, in your view, amid all the other great artists since the start of that musical form.
Yeah. Well, the fun thing about the Beatles is that you really, as a critic, you're constantly reaching for superlatives and hyperboles when you talk about them, and yet they seem to be constantly deserving those superlatives. Whenever a band these days enters the studio and tries to record an album of original songs, they are comparing themselves to the Beatles on a certain number of levels because the accomplishment is so strong and so rich and varied. The fact that the Beatles are still mainstays of any music format on any radio station today testifies to how well built all those recordings are. You know, they have yet to be equaled in almost any aspect of their accomplishment in terms of the range of output, the prolificness of the songwriting, the quality of recordings, of course the popularity. We haven't seen a phenomenon like the Beatles since the Beatles. And the sheer weight and richness of everything they had to say hasn't nearly been equaled by a group of 4 people involved in a single band again. Now, you can look at other careers and say, well, see, a band like Steely Dan had a number of big hits in the 70s, and they were creating quite sophisticated music, very jazz influenced, and they've just come back and made an album after a 20-year break that's every bit as strong as some of their earlier work. Those kinds of examples you can find, but even Steely Dan doesn't really live up to the whole Beatle mythology. There's something quite special and unique about the Beatle mythology that's a little bit more embracing. It's a little bit more universal. It's a little bit more, reaches out to many generations more than just a single generation. And it's a lot more accessible than a Steely Dan song. Steely Dan songs can often be puzzles. It's very hard to figure out what they're about. Beatles songs can come as puzzles, but they're usually surrounded by very accessible sentimental songs or romantic songs, and so there's just a great deal of accessibility there.
You've just given me a perfect lead-in to my next question, and it, in a way, it sounds a bit silly, but I'll give you the question, and then let me follow it up just a little bit. My question is actually, were the Beatles popular because they were good, or were they good because they're popular? I think you've already answered the last part of it. They truly were good in the view of people who are astute and know music. Does that account for their immediate popularity? Was the audience discerning enough? Did they see something there that was special in terms of the quality of the music, or they just liked the fresh look and the different hair? and I can remember '64 very well.
Well, we're still kind of puzzling over that because it's an alchemy that's very difficult to parse out. Because what was the initial appeal? Was the initial appeal the haircuts, which everyone talked about a lot at first, and they were very original and very outstanding, and nobody was wearing their hair like that, and all of a sudden these guys were very popular wearing their hair. But they wouldn't have been, the people wouldn't have been talking about the hair unless the music had put the hair across, unless there was something behind the hair to sort of make the hair meaningful, right? I mean, if it was for dumbbells with a new haircut, we wouldn't be talking about it. But it's an interesting question because they're one of the few cases in the history of pop culture where you have a mass reaction to a very high aesthetic standard. And when that happens in popular culture, in our popular media, it's a very exciting thing when it happens, because a lot of the time what you get are acts that are aimed at specific segments on the market, like teen acts. And they don't really have cross-generational appeal, and they don't really have long legs in terms of careers. I mean, we aren't, we would talk about Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears here today, but we're not talking about the New Kids on the Block anymore. Well, 5 or 6 years ago, there was New Kids on the Block. Well, the Beatles put together in 7 years an amazing career that's really jam-packed with high-quality material into a 7-year career that has never been duplicated. How much of that is, the aesthetic qualities are good, so the response was great, but in the Beatles, there's really this fascinating back and forth, because they were immediately very successful and very popular, and then they simply took advantage of that popularity and began challenging their audience with every record. So they had the best of both worlds. They never took their popularity for granted. In fact, they even had a great sense of humor about how popular they were and how seriously people would take them. They did not take themselves at all seriously, and that kind of worked very much in their favor, I would say. The popularity was part of their appeal. By the time you get to Sgt. Pepper, they're actually having fun with how popular they are. They make themselves into a fictional band.
Thank you very much.
For we who don't have your great expertise and knowledge of the different fields of music and composers and performers, would you take a little time to share with our viewers what the connection is between some of the great classical works and then how that was a bridge to the Beatles' music? Many of us have separated that in its totality, and we've been under a misconception.
Well, a misconception, I don't know. All I can do is speak from my own experience, and as a young pianist who went off to music school and studied piano and music theory and composition and music history, it just always seemed curious to me that all of the concepts they were teaching us by day in the music school, I would go home at night and listen to rock and roll records, and I could hear all of these concepts come alive in the music and the rock and roll that I had grown up loving. And the rock and roll was definitely a social activity for me. It was part of my coming-of-age experience in the 70s, and it was part of the way we interacted with one another as teenagers. It was, which songs do you like, and it was a way of discovering your identity. It was a way of saying, I respond to this kind of music and other people respond to this kind of music, and it was a way of figuring out who you were, and that's sort of one of the major themes of rock and roll and one of its great projects. So going along these parallel tracks and learning classical piano and having this great love of rock and roll all along, it just made all kinds of sense to me to apply a lot of these same concepts that I was learning from classical music and apply them to rock and roll music, because when you have a beautiful piece of music that's beautifully structured and has a wonderful frame around it, and every note is just perfectly placed, there's usually a good theoretical reason why that is so and why it works and why it stands up to so many repeated listenings. Because the only reason something is classic is if it stands the test of time, and if 200 years later we still say, well, that's really a great idea, that really sounds interesting and fresh, even though it's 200 years old. If those ideas and those concepts you can hear them in rock and roll, then why not just simply listen to the music in a similar manner and take it apart in a similar manner and gain a deeper appreciation of it in a similar manner, the way you might poetry or something like that. So I'm one of these critics who just has never understood or had much patience with this fictional barrier between classical elite music, which really was musical for the social elites in its time, and pop music, music for the masses, music that was created with a mass audience in mind. And the fact that the elites like the Beatles are okay with that. They say, fine. They actually laugh at us a little bit because we throw big terminology at them and say, you actually you're working in a Aeolian mode here in this song. And John Lennon thought that was hilarious. He thought it sounded like some strange exotic bird. But usually the discussion ends there. But what I like to add is well, it really was Aeolian mode. I mean, he really was dealing with a modal concept in the harmonics of that song that you could understand if you understand how modes work in classical music. And so your understanding of that can enrich your appreciation of what the Beatles' music, what it was doing. So the point I like to make is there's no reason that you have to choose one or the other. Why, if you enjoy Beethoven, why is it then expected for some reason that you shouldn't or couldn't enjoy the Rolling Stones? When we have both available there, why not enjoy both of them?
Thank you very much. Janelle.
I want to ask you a question about the Beatles' formal education. They really didn't have much formal musical education. But that's not the end of it. That doesn't mean they weren't musicians.
Well, yeah. Formal education, you're saying that with quotes around it.
Yes.
And
formal musical education.
Formal musical education, and they weren't really interested in the kind of formal musical education that they might have had access to growing up in Liverpool. But I would argue that they did have quite a rigorous formal music education in rock and roll terms. And in rock and roll terms, what that meant was they collected a whole bunch of records. And we know from biographies and from notebooks and from their own stage listings, the songs that they performed on stage, we know that they ingested a huge amount of material, of rock and roll song material. And they also played in Hamburg. They got the best training that you could ever get for a rock and roll band, which is they had to be on stage for 8 hours a night. So they had to play literally everything they knew every night. Well, this is a fantastic education from a number of points of view. It would be like saying, okay, we're going to push you out onto the stage, you're going to have to play Bach for 8 hours every night. Well, if you did that, you would gain a deep appreciation of Bach. Well, they just did the same thing with Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins and Buddy Holly and Little Richard and all of the great rock and rollers. They came to know, they immersed themselves in this music. They gained a very deep understanding of what makes it tick and how it works, and it made them both great players and singers, but also great songwriters. And then they adopted a kind of prideful attitude about it, as though, you know, we have basically our background in songwriting training and in band training and in singing training from all of these great rock and roll records. We don't need a formal education. And I would side with them. I'd be the first one to side with them as a classical pianist. They didn't need a formal music education. They wound up writing some of the great songs that we will ever know in our life. And they didn't get it from a formal education. So, you know, on the one hand, you can use it as a way of saying if you want to be a musician, you don't necessarily have to go to music school. I would say, I would temper that by saying, yeah, you know, the Beatles proved that you don't have to go to music school. They did hook up with a great music producer, though, in London named George Martin, who did attend music school, who helped them out a great deal. So there's a little bit of this protesting too much with the Beatles that, oh, we're so great and we didn't even go to music school. And I tend to think that, especially when Paul McCartney wants to write an orchestra piece, I would say to him, you know, it really wouldn't hurt if you went to music school. You know, you should learn how to notate music now. I mean, this would be my advice to him. But that's coming from a classical pianist. And
Tim, I can't resist, given your breadth of knowledge, asking you to pick things apart just a little bit.
Sure.
Would you help us grade the Beatles? And I'll go back over these anytime you want me to. First, as musicians, in terms of their technical ability to play their own instruments. Then as composers, both of music and lyrics. Then as performers, a stage band. And finally as actors, because they did have, unlike most musical groups, had a movie career in addition to their performing career.
Right. Well, that's the whole book right there. You just got, now everyone has to go read the book, because those are the issues I address all throughout the book. Is let's try and separate out all the different strands of greatness that we can find in the Beatles. And first we want to address them as musicians. What kind of...
I'm going to interrupt because viewers come in, and I'm going to plug your book at this point.
Oh, sure.
Again, the book is Tell Me Why, a Beatles Commentary. And so it's available for those about what you're about to talk about.
That's right. Well, first of all, as musicians, they are really wonderful, and most musicians, most pop musicians and rock musicians regard them as the greatest musicians on their individual instruments. Now, of course, there's controversy about this. People are going to choose other drummers to be the great rock drummer, etc. Mm-hmm. But the first and the most important thing to say in terms of their musicianship is that Ringo Starr is among the greatest drummers who has ever lived. And it's particularly important to say this because he genuinely gets a bad rap.
My next question was going to be to go through the band members, and that was where I was going to start with
Ringo. And I just have to always put in a word for Ringo Starr's drumming talent, because he is an extraordinary drumming talent. He has fantastic ears, and all of his drumming in every single Beatle track, his intent is to inflect the song in the best way possible at any given moment of the song. He's also a real rarity among rock drummers in that he's a rather modest rock drummer. He's a humble rock drummer. Most of all, when you think of the stereotypical rock drummer, you think of somebody who wants to show off and play a lot of solos. And Ringo rarely takes a solo. I can think of 2 drum solos in the entire Beatle catalog. One is on Sgt. Pepper, the reprise to the Sgt. Pepper song. And one is on side 2 of Abbey Road, where they give him this big spotlight and let him take a drum solo. And it's actually a very curious, interesting, non-flashy drum solo. What Ringo Starr really is a songwriter's drummer. He is a drummer who is very tuned into the architecture of a song. Right? And this is a very specific and narrow kind of specialized drumming that a lot of people don't appreciate. Then going through the other members, George Harrison, great lead guitarist, very tasteful lead guitarist. somebody in a guitar duel in a jam session will play circles around him, but he's very tasteful and has a very good ear and knows exactly how a guitar solo will suit a certain song and how a specific style of solo will suit a specific style of song. Paul McCartney is among the greatest bassists who have ever walked. I mean, one of the humblest things Paul McCartney ever did was decide that, okay, he was getting kicked out of being a guitarist, and the band needed a bassist, so he was going to fill in on that very unglamorous role of being the bassist, and he decided that he would turn the bass playing of a rock band into a completely original idea and come up with the most interesting, original, creative, melodic bass lines that rock and roll had ever heard. Now that may be Paul McCartney's biggest achievement, even bigger than being a great songwriter, because the old traditional role of the bass player was simply to play the bass line, and it was not a very interesting thing. But you can sit and listen to a Beatle record and concentrate simply on the bass line, and you will find Paul McCartney doing some really creative things there. And finally, John Lennon. I rate John Lennon as one of the great rhythm guitarists, and whenever he takes a guitar solo, especially on the second side of Abbey Road, where the three of them trade guitar solos, he takes very rhythmic solos, and I think he's got an expert sense of rhythm, and he's an underrated rhythm guitarist in the way that a rhythm guitarist provides rhythmic energy to the group. He's also one of the great rock and roll singers. So you have a band with four great instrumentalists and two great lead singers in Paul McCartney and John Lennon. You have a real magical recipe there. So then what's the next level we're going to talk about?
As writers of music.
As songwriters of music, again, they got their education by immersing themselves in the history of rock and roll songwriting, and they emerged very quickly as very strong songwriters who were interested in exploiting every aspect of rock and roll and then extending every aspect of rock and roll out into new territories. So the idea of a love song in the Beatles becomes something that's much richer than it had been before, and it actually is the larger story of the Beatles is a coming-of-age story. It's not just a coming-of-age story of the typical teen romance kind, getting your heart broken and learning from experience. It's actually a larger story of growing from a teenager into adulthood and learning what responsibilities come with adulthood and how you have to let certain teenage fantasies drop away. In late Beatles, it is very adult work. And the partnership between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the songwriting partnership, one of the most curious songwriting partnerships you can imagine. Two very different sensibilities working on these songs together. Paul McCartney, the optimist, the fantasist, the dreamer, the peacemaker, somebody who's always chipper, someone who's always ready, handy with a catchphrase, and very British in that way. And John Lennon, on the other hand, who's very cynical and very rebellious and very argumentative and has a great deal of anger and frustration, and he wants to put all that in his songs. So the two of them together make for a very interesting dynamic in songs. In fact, the one song you could pick out where you hear these personalities working against each other right in the same song is a song called We Can Work It Out, which is a Paul McCartney song, where the verse is, we can work it out. Every verse ends with we can work it out. But the bridge is written by John Lennon, and it changes instrumentation, and it goes into double time for extra frustration. And he sings, life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting. And it's this very sort of tense atmosphere that comes into the music at that point. And they literally wrote the song together, and it really is sort of, they're holding up signs. This is the Paul section, this is the John section. And the career of the Beatles, you see them work together and then drift apart. You see them writing songs more and more separately. So the songwriting level is another important aspect. And then you asked about their acting career in movies. You know, Ringo got a press as one of the better Beatle actors, but their movies were always a cut above the typical pop group movies that were produced in the era, because they're really interested in making better than average movies. And Hard Day's Night, I think, is their best movie, and the script that was written by Alan Owen does really capture the essence of Beatlemania, of being inside the bubble of what it must have felt like to be in Beatlemania, to be the object of Beatlemania, and be in this bubble, this strange bubble where only you and three other guys knew the score, and the rest of the world seemed to have gone slightly mad, and yet what you were trying to do, to create good music, really was the focus of all your energy and what made it all worthwhile. And the rest of it was simply madness. And that's still a very entertaining film to watch. The other film that I quite enjoy is Let It Be, which is the last film, where they invite the audience backstage to look at and take part in the creative process and show how songs get introduced. You know, you see day one of certain songs getting introduced, played alone on the guitar, and then you see these songs go through several evolutions and reach their final form when they perform on the rooftop at the end of the movie. And it's a fascinating and generous kind of thing to do for the most famous band in the world, to invite the audience backstage and say, here's our creative process, this is how we do it. I've always been very impressed. I always thought that was a very heroic kind of impulse.
We have just about a minute left, maybe a little over a minute. One thing I'd like for you to get across with the viewers, and that is that John Lennon and Paul McCartney had, as you said, different backgrounds, but didn't they take their childhood and do it in a different way? One optimistic, that had very different childhood.
Yeah, I talk about how Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever are two different songs that show the very different sensibilities that are at work there with Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Paul McCartney's song, they're both songs about childhood, reminiscing about childhood, and that wish for lost innocence. And Penny Lane is Paul McCartney's song, and he's very upbeat and optimistic, and it's just a tad quirky, and there's some really wonderful writing in it. He says there's a pretty nurse who's selling poppies from a tray, and though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway, which gives it this wonderful double-edged scenario there. And then in Strawberry Fields Forever, you have this very dark, haunted, fearful view of childhood, where childhood is really full of confusion and darkness and pain, and that's John Lennon's view of childhood. So that the idea that they both wrote their views of childhood and put them out together on the same 45 as one single, it has always been like the most dramatic example you could get of how different their sensibilities were.
And their lives were so different. On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of our panel and our staff, Tim Riley, thank you. It's been wonderful having you here on our TV program and on our campus. You have enlightened us so much on something that was a major part of not only music around the world, but certainly in this country. And we hope you can come back at some future time. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Tim Riley, who's an accomplished composer and pianist and author, among other books, of Tell Me Why, a Beatles commentary, and we'd urge you to read that if you have the interest in the Beatles, as most of you do. It's a great work. I would like to invite you to be back with us again next week at this very same time, when we're going to continue our journey through America's 20th century. We're having a great joy bringing this to you, and we hope that you will be with us again at this same time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.